All right. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, I have a returning guest. His name is Vallibus. He goes by JJ as well. We're going to talk about Arthur C. Clarke's The Sentinel. And last time we were together, we talked about Robert Heinlein's Stranger in a Strange Land. That was very well received. People were very interested in that. So this book was published in 1951. It was actually a short story, but it's a precursor to his later work in 2001, A Space Odyssey. So I think it's very important to kind of see this spot in time where Arthur C. Clarke was writing about this mysterious thing or monolith on the moon. So, JJ, are you there?
Yeah, Mr. William Ramsey, great speaking with you again today. Thanks for having me back. I also enjoyed the last conversation. Thought it was very fruitful of information, and I enjoyed it.
Yeah,
so
me too.
Looking forward to this one as well. And I think Arthur C. Clarke may, in fact, be a more interesting character than Robert Heinlein.
Yeah, for sure. Very interesting character. So what were your impressions about The Sentinel when you reread it recently?
It is recently because to be quite candid, I'm not a science fiction fan whatsoever. So these are the first time I've read some of these works, or second time, I've read some of these works. So I'm not, these are all, I'm reading them for these discussions for the most part, or, have a greater understanding of who these group of people really were.
Right.
And, but I have an interest in science and some in fiction, but not so much of the spaceship exploration stuff that these folks, seem to focus on.
Right. I don't think I am either, but I do think that it's fascinating to see what they're writing about it at any given time, what their impressions were. So particularly this book, I mean, considering the import and impact of 2001, A Space Odyssey, I think that this is an important work that probably gets left out in Kubrick Clarke discussions.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's and that's kind of why I chose it. I think it's often overlooked as it was the precursor to the film masterpiece,
right,
which was unlike any other film at its time. I mean, that was really a monumental breakthrough in filmmaking. The 2001 A Space Odyssey, in I believe it was the summer of 1968.
Right. So this is 51. I mean, what do you want to talk about the Sentinel itself and the short story?
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of touched it on already. Kind of one of the most important characteristics of the story that I found most important was the talk of these monoliths. It seems to be an underlying, kind of concept in a lot of these science fiction stories of terrestrial, folks living on other planets, whether you want to call them aliens or extraterrestrials, whatever you want to call them. But and that these folks had civilizations that had long predated ours, and that's kind of the gist of what that whole,
right.
Not just Heinlein, not just Clarke here, but also Heinlein as well. They they're kind of emphasizing we're not the first people to live on a planet and build things, and these other people left monuments on other planets.
Right. So
without those concepts, I don't know we would have people like Buzz Aldrin going on. I think was C-SPAN a few years ago and saying there's a monolith on Mars. His little monolith on Mars speech. Without those concepts, though, without Clarke inserting these ideas, or Heinlein for that matter, I'm not sure that we would have those ideas and concepts in our society. And I think that's my biggest takeaway on like a strategic level from the story was the concepts of space that are formed, but also individually and more of a tactical level, just the like I said, the previous civilizations, the other people living on other planets. These ideas are perpetrated through these stories, and I think that's a lot where our society gets them from today.
But Clarke isn't just important for his short stories. I mean, he was involved in the moon landing, so he was a color commentator for that. I mean, really remarkable person.
Which is really interesting if you think about it. I mean, why it was him and Heinlein, correct? Is that correct?
I think so. I think that's
With Walter, I believe Walter Cronkite,
right? Who also, was commentating on when Kennedy got killed, right? So
right.
He's very interesting characters.
He was a gatekeeper of that time for information for sure. So he's expected to be there, But these other guys, I don't, what are their tie-ins? They're science fiction writers.
Right, but I mean, in some ways, Clarke science fiction became reality. He was the guy who came up with the idea of the geosynchronous orbit of satellites. So that was his kind of concept. Yeah. So he was definitely a scientist as well as a science fiction author, but also an interesting guy. I mean, his books are stocked with occult references, and this book, this Sentinel, didn't really have it, but the 2001 Space Odyssey book that he wrote was just chock full of stuff.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I mean, the original Sentinel was a pyramid, right? So it's supposedly a pyramid twice the size of a man in the middle of a natural plateau, 300 miles in diameter. And that was somebody who was on there saw this metallic glitter, and then they figured out what it was. And I think they nuked it right in the short story, and then it gave off some kind of sound, and that's why it was the Sentinel for other intelligences, right?
Sure. Yeah, that's precisely. Yeah.
But then,
I think that's he's underlying that concept. We'll continue, but I think that's a concept he's really trying to drive home right there in that story.
Right. So the other things, but then in the book that reference, I mean, so he writes the book when working on the film with Kubrick, but then they turn it from a pyramid to a tall 11-foot tall monolith, right?
Right, correct.
So there is the kind of 11 again, the number of magic, and its dimensions are strange too. But that's even kept on in the film. There's a really interesting book by a guy by the name of Benson. It came out. It's the Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick, Arthur C. Clarke, and the Making of a Masterpiece, published in, I think it's 2018. A really good book because it shows the background, but they were about to put they're going to turn their monolith in as a black cube, like a black cube of Saturn. Yeah. So they went through different iterations of this kind of symbol that they were going to use, but really fascinating.
And like you said, they landed on a monolith in the actual full story of it, and in the film. And the monolith, I think, it bears a striking resemblance, at least in concept and principles, to an obelisk.
Sure,
they're not one and the same, but they're it's essentially the same thing.
Right. It's like a big, tall, eerie structure. Yeah.
And once you start thinking down that path, I don't think much like you said that Clarke and Heinlein have been they've established the concepts, whether it be geosynchronous orbit, whether it be of satellites, whether it be rocketry altogether, or space exploration. Where Heinlein still has an award for his name for space exploration every year, going to somebody, getting awarded every year. So, and I think, and along these lines, if you think about along those lines, and they're doing the narration for the Apollo 11 moon mission. Well, I mean, in a sense, from my perspective, the Apollo 11 rocket is a giant obelisk.
Right. And there's your 11th again, yeah.
And you beat me to it, and there's your 11 again, and it just seems to circle right back with these people along the same lines and the same concepts. They're all kind of doing the same thing. They're all into ancient aliens. That's right. Again, the Sentinel's an ancient alien story about how they established a civilization on the moon many years ago, and I think eons ago is what they try to say, which is thousands of years, and. And then they have a giant obelisk they're launching in the quote unquote space in July 16th of 1969. And the fuel that's operating that is built from a Thelemic sex magic ritual.
Right. So it goes back to Parsons, the original stuff that was building up to.
So it's always circling back to that same group because Parsons, and as we've discussed in the past, that's part of that same group, the Parsons and the L. Ron Hubbards and whatnot.
Right. Are you a moon landing believer or non-believer?
No, I'm not I've thought about it a lot, and it's kind of funny to even, in my opinion, even think we actually did it.
Yeah, I do too.
There's mountains of evidence, in my opinion, that says we did not. I mean, it's the story. The story paints a picture in and of its own.
No, there's tons of problems, but I think for me it was very hard to believe that they would go through with that. But no, I don't think we ever made it to the middle. I don't think humanity's made it past the Van Allen belt. So I agree. Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I'd have to see a lot of some evidence to support that they did if they did and how they accomplished such. But not in that rudimentary thing that they show on TV. There's no way. I mean, it's stuff. Yeah. Anyway.
Right, the tin can, like the whole performance seems so like a community theater today.
Yeah, community theater. I mean, maybe it was convincing back then, but now
I'm sure it was.
Where's the gas? How did the moon lander just suddenly? I mean, the 4-wheel drive thing come out of it. I mean, it's just all kinds of problems. Man.
Yeah, the Jeep in the suitcase. Yeah, that's always a problem for them to explain.
Yeah. So, but yeah, Clarke, really interesting character. Have you ever read Hoffman's view of what the what the monolith is in what is it? Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare, that book?
I'm familiar with the book, but I don't recall what.
Let me read it into the record if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is what he writes about it. The mute monolith of 2001 is a harbinger of what Clarke calls, in another of his works, the Overlord. It is the ashlar of the secret societies. The monolith represents the shaping function of the occult magus who tames and tampers with the natural world. And the 2001 monolith is a stake that impales the divine organic in favor of anthropomorphic artifice. It is one of the totems of human brain power and of the cryptocrats who imagine themselves the most cerebral of us all.
Wow.
Pretty interesting, huh?
That's pretty deep too.
Yeah. That book, that's a whole nother story, is that book of Hoffman, how he compiled that book before. And unfortunately, there's no footnotes or anything in that book, but it's pretty remarkable book.
Right. Yeah. The guy was notorious for writing some extensive conspiracy type novels. So, I'm not surprised that I don't recall that quote off the top of my head from reading it, but it definitely sounds like something he would write.
But it makes sense. It's the ashlar, right? So it's a symbol of what comes out. Each Mason is an ashlar of the Masonic wall, right? So in a lot of ways, you can interpret the whole sequence of the apes and the monolith in 2001 in an occult, through an occult lens. Yeah.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
No, continue. I see what you're saying. You're saying this is an evolution type of.
Yeah. Well, that's the whole thing, is that even the evolution is a hoax, right? It's right. An occult telling of so if you're on the inside and you understand what the monolith is, then you might be able to see this evolution as a more occult, magical mind frame than a science mind frame. Does that make sense?
No, I see what you're saying. I agree. Yeah. So, I think there's a lot of that double meaning there. Just on the surface level, you got a double meaning of the sci-fi writer Clarke, who's doing the narration for the Apollo 11 missions, but he's also writing a book about the Apollo, about 2001: A Space Odyssey with Stanley Kubrick,
right,
who is deeply ingrained in the Apollo 11 missions.
Right, and here's the other thing.
No reason to be, but he is. He's deeply ingrained in it.
Right. Do you know this Benson book that I mentioned? It's very interesting because it talks about those two being together in New York City as the Twin Towers are being built, being 2 blocks away, hammering out their concepts for this film.
Wow.
It's pretty incredible. So they're walking in the shadow of what happened in 2001 in early 60s.
Yeah.
Arguing. And I think that Clarke was staying at the Chelsea Hotel, right? This famous hotel where all this stuff happens. And who else is he hanging out with at the same time? It's what's the guy who wrote Naked Lunch? It's I see his face. Anyway, it's this famous beat writer, right?
Oh, Burroughs.
Yeah, Burroughs. So he's hanging out with Burroughs at night when during the day he's hanging out with Kubrick. It's incredible. Yeah, it's really incredible.
Burroughs is up there as far as is with Highlander and Clarke, and the rest of the thing is just an extremely interesting character.
Yeah,
in his activities in life.
Tons of occult records, and some of his other. So, in Clarke, this is all from my book Children of the Beast. And my segment on Clarke is he went on when he wrote 2010. The Jupiter became Lucifer, right? And then Lucifer shines down on the world, and he has a quote. It says, "A generation would soon be born that had never known a world without Lucifer," unquote. Can you believe that? He got away with writing that. And then they send something back to Earth on Bowman, and it's an 11-letter word phrase, 11-word phrase. "All these worlds are yours except Europa. Attempt no landings there." And it was sent to Earth 93 times.
Wow. There's some symbology structured through all that, isn't there?
Oh, yeah. Rendezvous with Rama is the same thing. This is all Childhood's End, Kay, Carolyn, all these. He knew all that stuff. So
you had to have a great
my book, Children of the Beast. Yeah.
You had to have a great, an extensive occult knowledge base in order to insert these things into the stories, then, obviously.
Yep. And connected. I think he was connected. He had to have been, I don't know if he was a Mason or what, but the guy definitely had connections and seemed to have pull. When they had that whole thing in the Sunday Mirror with him having sex with young boys, that thing just disappeared right off of the internet.
And not only that, they kind of played it off as we all knew he was doing it for a while. We just told him to stop, and when he didn't, we just sent him to another country. You know what I mean? They were kind of accepting it that was the proper procedure to take. I don't know.
But that's the weird thing about these guys is there are rumors about Kubrick as well. These guys were, pedophiles.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, and Kubrick again, he's got pull. I mean, you're talking while he's doing the project of 2001: A Space Odyssey with Clarke, he's the NASA administrators, including Werner von Braun from the Apollo missions, are visiting the stage, the sound stage and movie set. They're
the big guy from NASA. His name is Mueller,
right?
Robert Mueller. There's pictures of Clarke, Kubrick, and Mueller, the head of NASA, all together at sound stages.
And they're in London, correct? If I'm not mistaken, he filmed in London, right?
Yeah, it's all there.
So what would require the NASA guys to go over there to London to meet with this director guy, who is also they've given a camera to film this movie, right?
Right. So he had the highest technology, right?
Right. He had the greatest technology available, a camera that was awarded to him by NASA, as the story goes.
Yeah. No, it's all there, man. I tell you.
And back to the same concepts of Heinlein and Clarke kind of establishing what we know today as quote unquote science of space. I mean, Kubrick did the same thing. Because without Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey in the summer of '68, the summer of '69, with the astronauts slowly jumping through them on the moon, it would not have looked proper to people. I don't think. Right. I think that movie was the first time, and you saw that the astronauts acted the same way in space. They're slow moving, kind of jumping. No different than you see in the Apollo 11 missions. It's very, very similar. So I think he kind of set the stage for that, much like the science fiction story set the stage for the other science with the satellites, the rockets, etc. Right. He's setting the stage with how astronauts move, like their ability to move in space.
Yeah, no, those are very heady, incredible events. I mean, it's just it's unbelievable to think that they went as far as to fake the moon landing and convince really the world, really create a fake history.
Sure.
With all those astronauts and all that stuff. And I think that I don't know exactly when Kubrick and Clarke fled to their places, like Kubrick left to England and never came back, and then Clarke
built a moat
to Sri Lanka. Yeah, they just
Kubrick built a moat around his house. That's what he was scared.
He was scared of something. Yeah, like he was involved. And I mean, if you look at Grissom, the story behind the story of the Grissom burning is that they did it intentionally. You ever hear that story?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, so he was complaining about it, I'm not going to fake this, and said, okay, well, here's what you get. You're all going to, you're all going to get torched, and it's a terrible accident, right?
It's certainly plausible. It's certainly plausible because he was deeply ingrained in whatever was going on there.
Yeah, and I heard that he was kind of a loudmouth, and he was a stiff neck, and he was stubborn, and maybe he just didn't go with the program, and these other guys didn't have a choice, Sure. It's like Moonraker. What was it? Not Moonraker. What was Capricorn 1? You ever see Capricorn 1?
Oh, yeah, with O.J. Simpson.
Yep. Yeah. That was kind of a play on the whole moon landing is fake story, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's how I took it, too. I mean, I just watched it probably 4 or 5 years ago for the first time. But, yeah, I mean, if you could just replace the word Mars with the word moon, it would be the same thing.
Yes, exactly. And almost like the kind of lead bad guy looks like kind of like a cutout of a CIA agent of that time, and he's like, "We didn't have a choice but to fake it. We were in a battle against the communists, and that's the same rationale supposedly that why we faked the moon landing before." Really good version. Have you ever read McGowan's Wagging the Moon Doggy?
I have actually. It's actually
that's
a series.
Really good one. Yeah, that's a good one.
I discovered that a number of years ago. It was one of the first people to make me really reconsider the subject.
Me too. It was much easier for me to believe 9/11 was fake than the moon was faked, actually.
Yeah, it was really tough for me. Just from a personal note, my grandfather was the lead engineer on Hubble, and my uncle was the head of different side of my family, was director of security for Ames Research Center at NASA. Oh, so you have a lot of NASA people in my family.
Gotcha.
But
that's an interesting
to come to that conclusion.
Yeah. I mean, NASA itself is a pretty peculiar administrative body for a lot of reasons.
Oh yes. Well, I mean, if you think about it, it still very much serves and functions as a military organization. I mean, it's secretive. It operates in the same fashions that a military organization would as far as operations and procedures go. Right. And they started out as part of the Air Force. So from 1940 was it 47 to 1958, right? Was the National Security Act of 1947 created the United States Air Force, and then rolled up the space operations into that, which the Air Force still does a good deal of it. They have a whole Space Force command. And in fact, they do all the launches. So a lot of the NASA launches go out of, for example, Vandenberg Air Force Base or Cocoa Beach there in Florida at the Johnson or the Kennedy Space Center. which is another Air Force base, like skipping my mind at the moment. But so I mean, there's still, those two organizations are still very much intertwined today. So you really can't have one without the other.
Right.
So as far as it being a civilian organization, I don't know that it ever really has been. And there's records. I mean, there's records on record in the 1960s, right? Mm-hmm. There's a dude, I can't remember his name right now. He's running the Johnson Space Center down there. Was that the one in Houston? I believe, yeah, Houston. And he's wearing his Nazi SS uniform to work every day.
Wow. Interesting.
And it's accepted. Like no one's complaining about it, right? Like there's not like a big fuss about it, it seems. Like historically speaking, looking back on the matter, it does seem like everybody was okay with it.
Yeah, man, it's incredible stuff.
Well, it speaks to where that organization grew from, though, too, because it clearly grew from its Nazi roots.
Well, I've actually seen the calculations of Werner von Braun. Like I've seen these. You got to remember, this is pre-computer. They had to do all of the high-level calculus and algebra by hand, and it's. I mean, his calculations are super advanced. The guy was really smart, man. Like you can just see his book because there's so many little moving pieces on a rocket at that time. You didn't have the computers to figure it out for you.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, I mean, mathematics is definitely a language that's being lost in our current society. That's for
sure. Well, if you have just hit buttons and have the computer do it for you.
Right.
I remember they used to make us do everything by hand just for that reason, right?
Oh, so absolutely. That's how I did it still when I was in school.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't all that many years ago they decided to quit teaching cursive to students. I was like, why? How are they going to sign their name?
Right. No, these kids are going to be totally different than us, man.
Oh, every time I see something going on in society, I just don't care for. I just arbitrarily say, "Oh, thank a teacher," because that's the way it is anymore. They're not teaching these kids whatever they're doing to them.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of indoctrination now, which is a whole nother show. But God, I don't know if they're really teaching. I really don't know if they're.
I don't think they are. Yeah, I don't. I think it's been lost for years. I don't think anything I experienced was technically called teaching.
Anyway, so any other thoughts about the Sentinel? Anything to add? Anything we missed? I
think we just covered the highlights of it. I mean, it is a short story. It was brief, and it was then transpired into a greater story of the 2001: A Space Odyssey. And in that effort, I just think it's interesting to look at the time frame, the parties involved, and the general topics that are included. The ancient aliens to the obelisks to the concepts of what we know now today as space science, and was then is just space science fiction.
So when they were working on the movie, the intent when they were working together, Clarke and Kubrick, was that Kubrick was going to they were owning it together. Kubrick was going to put out the film and Clarke was going to put out the book at the same time, right?
That's how I understood it, yes.
But Kubrick pulled a fast one on Clarke and would not give him the rights to publish part of his book for another 2 years so that his film would be predominant and not compete with the book. And Clarke was pissed, but he said he forgave Kubrick later. But Kubrick kind of outmaneuvered. I mean, Kubrick, if you look at his negotiating and stuff, he was something else. I did Stanley Kubrick Producers. I interviewed the guy who wrote that book, Fenwick, and you can just see this how savvy Kubrick was.
He seemed like a brilliant man.
Yeah, brilliant guy, but his negotiating skills. He was playing to win, and I think he kind of played to win over Clarke too.
It sounds like it. I knew there was a break there. I didn't realize, when the release of those, I didn't realize there was such a beef between the two.
Yeah, there was a beef. I mean, it was a beef because Kubrick said, "No, I'm not going to let you publish this book while my movie comes out." But he would do funny things. He got into the minds of the people he was working around. So when he had a good idea for a movie, he would intentionally have a producer fly over from Hollywood, but he would make them wait at the hotel for 2 days. So he would pull like stunts where I'm really busy tomorrow. Sorry, can you?
That's a power move right there, and that's a
real power move. So the guy would be all the way over and waiting, and like so the guy waiting at the hotel in his mind, he's like, I'm not going to ruin this adventure, and I'm nervous, and I really want to get this deal done. And Kubrick would just be sitting around fiddling his thumbs, because ramping this guy up. And so he used that as a negotiating tactic.
Wow.
Yeah. And he said it was from his early chess skills. He's a chess master, that he learned to move these pieces around on a film like a chessboard.
I can see it because I think the guy was brilliant. I mean, I'm a big fan of film, and I'm a big fan of writing. Writing a film is what I pay attention to most. Outside of just, some people pay attention to the acting. I care less for the most part. If it's not written well, it's going to be a shitty movie anyhow.
Right.
So So I think he hit a home run with that movie too. I mean, 2001: A Space Odyssey it plays today still. Well, a lot of movies from that era do not.
Look at the relevance of his films. They're still being talked about.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Vietnam film, Eyes Wide Shut, Lolita.
The Shining is one of my favorite movies.
Yeah, Shining. All of his movies were really incredible.
I've wondered, he started incorporating other ideas, unlike other, film story producers and film directors. That like The Shining, the hotel is built on a mound. That seems to be the underlying.
It's like an Indian burial.
Yeah, it's an ancient Indian burial mound. Like that's the underlying story for the Poltergeist. For you name the movie of the era. Pet Sematary. Yeah, you name
Stephen King, right? All Stephen King says.
Stephen King loves it. Steven Spielberg loves mound stuff.
Yep.
And then Stanley Kubrick even said, "You know what, guys? I like what you're doing there. I'm going to do that too." So there's just some of those concepts like that. I think that's a very occult concept. I think not one I fully even understand, and I've studied it for years. And I don't know what these groups' obsessions are with the mounds, but they have obsessions with them. And I do know that much, and it's on and above just looking at it like, oh, that's a cool structure.
Right.
And speaking of mathematics, the mathematics are deeply ingrained into all those mounds, especially the larger structures. I mean, there is some unique geometry that can't be replicated today, and there is some. For example, the Serpent Mound in Ohio, it's a calendar for the sky. It'll tell you the seasons, the change of the weather. I mean, everything. Anything you need to know about the sky, that thing will read it. And someone knew that advanced geometry and mathematics thousands of years ago. So maybe the ancient aliens concept and these mounds concepts, these people, they coincide. I don't know.
Well, people always say that the past people were not as intelligent, which I don't buy that. They just were working with different different structures and ideas. But I mean, if you don't have a TV or anything, you're much more attuned to the changing of the seasons than we are today, especially if you're waiting for farming or something like that.
Oh, absolutely. There's almost no evidence supporting the claim that people of the past were dumb. Right. I mean, even just a couple hundred years ago. I mean, the start of this country alone, the literacy rate was greater than it is today.
You're right. I mean, no, it's true.
And then George Washington, for example, he had a PhD in mathematics by the age of 16.
Didn't know that.
Or the equivalent of.
Oh, I didn't know that. So he used that for all of his cartography or whatever.
Absolutely, and traveling and mapping out the United States, the early colonies in the Ohio country,
and Alexandria, right? So didn't he map out Alexandria?
He did. Virginia? Yeah, basically anything from Virginia through Ohio. Yeah, he was mapping that stuff out, and he also, for whatever reason, mapped out the mounds.
Fascinating.
And he spoke 8 languages. I think it was with the natives. I mean, he spoke every native language of the Iroquois. I'm sorry,
right. So he was there at the 7 Years' War, right? So he was involved in the backcountry in those wars.
Sure.
There were some gnarly stories about George Washington. I mean, that's a whole nother work, but they kind of paint him as the head of state. But in his frontier years, it was about as lethal as you could imagine. Like he was hanging out with natives, cutting people's heads off. The natives were. They used to actually scalp people and then crack their brain open and then put their hands in their brain and lash their brains up. So George Washington was exposed to all that.
That's pretty brutal. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and he seemed, and at least his history tells it, he made peace with many of those people.
Yeah, Fort Ticonderoga, right?
Yep.
That was that battle. Yeah.
Yep, that's right there, the south end of Lake Champlain in New York State.
Yeah, so all those Indian tribes are gone.
Well, I mean, just all those people are far more brilliant than most people are today. You know what I mean? Like, there is definitely a declining just over a larger, amount of time of education. But even since the Department of Education was created in this country, like 1978.
Have you seen some of the old tests they gave kids back at the turn of the century?
Oh yeah,
they're incredibly. They're like they would be called college age now.
I was going to say they'd be master's level education today.
Yeah. It just shows how dumbed down we've become and how lazy and how well educated in the classics and things in mathematics these people were back in the 19th century.
And I don't know. There's anything that really connects the occult groups of America or the world to the dumbing down of America or the world for that matter. I'm not sure what the education level of many other countries are. I've not paid any attention, but I mean, it seems to be that the more that these occult groups have taken hold of America, America's gotten dumber.
Dumber, yeah.
There's a loss of liberty. There's a loss of independence. There's a loss of personal liberties.
Yep. No, I totally agree.
And it kind of goes in line with their concept of operations, because their concept of operations is they're going to lie to you about a moon mission. They're going to put on some quote unquote magic show on a grand stage, right? So I mean, deception's written all over that.
Right.
Deception's the opposite of personal liberties.
Agreed. Yeah, well, the slaves have to serve, right? So you got to keep the serfdom down, afraid, and poison them, and do all that fun stuff.
And I think that's a good portion of those the two subjects we're talking here connect, because that's I think that's one of the goals of these kind of groups and their productions of for the masses, multi-purpose, I'm sure, but for the masses, for the profane, the folks that are not inclined to know what these things mean. The goal is to entertain these people, make them as dumb as possible.
Right, and you can actually see Clarke and Kubrick as one of the early technocrats, I think. Because,
absolutely. They may have invented the field of it, because again, a lot of this starts with those guys.
Right.
Without the concepts these guys established, we don't have many other things.
Right, we don't have the technocratic age. We don't have Brzezinski. We don't have a lot of these people. Jacques Ellul, all these guys.
Yeah, I think they very much laid the baseline of it back then. And again, you have to look at it over a swath of time, because you're looking at, he wrote this story, I think initially, you said 1951 was published.
51, yes, correct.
I think it's initial, like he initially started writing it like 48, maybe,
I think you're right now.
And it was he later published it, because for some reason this seemed like a story he didn't really want to do. Like he didn't want to expound upon it later, when I think in the 80s he added a bunch of other short stories under an umbrella of the Sentinel, and he seemed to not want to do that then. He seemed to be kind of against it across the board, and it just seems like an odd opinion for a writer to have his own work. Like he's doing it for a purpose that he doesn't fully agree with, maybe.
Maybe. I mean, him and Kubrick, maybe the whole moon landing, they got cajoled into it, bribed or blackmailed, or who knows?
And and who knows what else other grand schemes or plans that are involved with, and that's just a component of that they may not agree with. They're like, well, I was doing this portion, but I don't agree with that portion.
Right.
And they see what's going on a grander scale, maybe not agree with the grander scale, because at the end of the day, no different than NASA, the U.S. Air Force, the government at large, or other organizations such as those, they're compartmentalized. These occult organizations and stuff, they're no different from my outside purview of them. But I mean, seemingly that's how they operate internally. They're very compartmentalized.
Right. I mean, it's actually the real story of those years of 1969, 2001: A Space Odyssey, and the moon landing are really something else. Yeah, the real history is much more interesting than the fake.
Oh, I'd love to know it. I mean, you brought up Dave McGowen, and I mean, he reinvented the '60s history for me. Like I didn't know anything of that stuff was going on between the moon landings and the Laurel Canyon scene that he wrote about with the intelligence, the cold agents, same group of people, same network, same. Not exact same group of people, but the same ilk, the same philosophy of people.
Right. The same kind of, we're going to create a huge myth for the masses.
Yeah, deception. Deception is at its root.
Like enchant them or something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
that's exactly it. And if you look at that whole scene, the whole scene was magical.
Right. Like they're all,
McGowan wrote a whole chapter in his book how all these bands first started out with magical names, whether it's the Grateful Dead, who were the Warlocks,
right,
or the Mamas and the Papas, who were like, they had some other. It was something to do with the like the circle or whatever, the magical circle or something. Yeah, that was their initial names, and then these same group of people are allegedly process members, as it would later pan out within the LA prosecutor's office when they're looking for people as witnesses for the Manson prosecution.
Right, either process members or members of the elite or some military intelligence, the sons and daughters. Yeah, pretty crazy stuff.
But I mean, again, the process you're talking, it's an offshoot of Scientology, and Scientology and L. Ron Hubbard both originate back in the same sci-fi writers club.
Back to Mark Parsons and all
with Clarke.
characters.
Yeah, but he interacted with Clarke. He interacted with Heinlein. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're all at the same time. In fact, Clarke, I think, had some. He even did some work with L. Ron Hubbard's college roommate, Corbin Smith. I think they wrote a story or two together.
Interesting.
And Corbin Smith is really, that's a pen name, and the dude really wrote he's a U.S. Army officer in World War II. He wrote the U.S. Army's handbook on psychological warfare.
Right. I think you mentioned that last interview. Yeah.
And and again, so there's that, you have that connection. There's this underlying connection between all these little groups. You have the psychological warfare, military intelligence,
Scientology be seen as psychological warfare. Yeah.
Oh, I mean,
the moon landing, all
he
that
incorporated so much psychological warfare in that system. It seems unreasonable looking at it from the outside, knowing what kind of where he came from and where he got some of those ideas from. You can see how he applied it, and it's just like, wow, that dude was evil.
Yeah, really evil. Yeah, he messed up so many people's lives. It's off the charts.
Yeah, and it still goes on. And they wield a powerful hand. They wield a powerful hand that I don't think many people see publicly.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
I mean,
I agree with that. They're a technocrat. Hubbard is really kind of a technocrat, a modern psychological technocrat.
That's what I was going to say. That's exactly what I was going to say, because he what they do now is they're all concentrated on purveying their ideas through film. And it's not just Battlefield Earth.
Right.
I don't disagree with all their ideas. Some of their greatest ideals of the Scientology group, because Scientology clock is correct twice a day, just like any other broken clock.
Right.
And they made a film in, I think it was 1997. It's almost exclusively a Scientology cast, Enemy of the State. And if you watch that film today, it still plays as far as films go, and it also tells the story of the age we're living in now. And Enemy of the State with
Will Smith is a Scientology film?
Oh, I mean, the cast is almost exclusively Scientology.
I didn't know that. Wow,
you can look at it as if Scientology had nothing to do with it, but what's the threshold of Scientologists in the film before you realize you want to say that Scientology probably played some role in that?
Right, because Smith is a Scientologist, right? Or wasn't it some offshoot or something like that?
Yeah, at the time he was operating a charter school.
Right.
Shortly thereafter, and he got for an L. Ron Hubbard charter school. You don't get that. You don't get that license without being a member.
I remember that. Yeah.
And his wife was on record saying that she's dabbled in Scientology kind of admission. But that's kind of at the end of the day, a lot of them don't talk about it.
Right.
And some of them are very public about it.
That movie had a secret 9/11 in it too. I think it was.
Really?
Yeah, it was. Gene Hackman. I think his either. Where was it? It was either in the license that he had or something. There was a secret 9/11. I have to look that up.
Yeah,
and it really is there.
That's interesting. I'll look back at that
too. Prominent 9/11 too.
It's got a lot of that underlying stuff, and that's what I'm saying. I've rewatched it just maybe 2 months ago, and I was like, wow, this is really interesting. And again, Jack, for example, I mean, across the board, Gene Hackman, I'm not sure about, but how many movies can you do with Tom Cruise before you're suspected of being a Scientologist? And Will Smith and Jason Lee was one of their prominent Scientologists at the time.
Yeah, Jason Lee, and then you got Travolta. You got all these characters. There's a lot of them.
Jason Lee plays a small role in Enemy of the State, but it's an integral role. He starts off the whole mystery thriller situation.
That's right. He was the one who got the film tape, right? So
correct.
He had the secret tape. He's the Scientologist. You're right.
Yep. And then Giovanni Ribisi.
Right.
Jack Black.
He's a Scientologist.
Oh yeah! If you listen to Tenacious D song, he even pays tribute to L. Ron Hubbard in Scientology and Dianetics.
I didn't know that. Wow.
I forget the name of the song off the top of my head, but I can send it to you afterwards. You can put it in the show notes if you'd like. But yeah, he. I mean, is he a Scientologist? I mean, he's paying tribute to Scientology in a song. So I mean, it seems like it's not a far jump.
Yeah, I mean, some of those guys probably aren't that public. You just don't know who's over at the celebrity center at any given time, right?
No, and then you get to the film production; they're deeply ingrained in film production. So I mean, in music even the scores of film. Most of the films, the big films, and even major musical hits of recent years of recent decades. The singer Beck, that's not his real name.
Beck, that's right.
That's his stage name, but he's a Scientologist, but his father is the producer and scorer of music of all sorts of films.
Yeah, Beck Campbell, I think, or something like that.
I think you're right, Beck Campbell. Not much music-wise gets made in Hollywood without his father's, involvement.
That's crazy.
So
Well, I
that's
got to
what
wrap this up. I got to head off to another interview. What anything you'd like to add before I wrap this up?
No, I mean, I think the biggest thing on the underlying tone I'm starting to see through a lot of these people is the psychological warfare aspects of their stories. Because not only are they convincing people of space and the concepts and quote unquote science of space, what I'll allege is the fake concepts and fake science of space. They they go on to purvey other psychological warfare tactics within their stories of other deception. And again, not all of it's deception, because again, enemy of the state, I tend to agree with most of that message. The government doesn't need to be spying on everybody, and we're entering into a state of technology where that's all they're going to do, full speed ahead.
It's beyond spying. They're just going to have a full record of your life from birth to death. That's what's even more crazy is you'll have your own personal dossier.
Yeah, and that's kind of if you really watch Enemy of the State, that's kind of what they're warning about.
Yeah, crazy.
The coming age of that.
Yeah. Well, we're here. I think we're actually there. They probably have all that stuff available.
Oh yeah. So, I mean, 1997, we were kind of on the cusp of it, but yeah, by the early 2000s, it was definitely in full speed ahead.
That's great. Well, that's a great conversation, man. Again, it's Vallibus or JJ, and really appreciate your time. Really fascinating.
Oh, William Ramsey, excellent conversation. Enjoyed it.
Let's do it again soon.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Take care.
Yep. Out here. Thanks.
All right, bye-bye.